So at about the age of 25, John Stuart Mill discovered romance, love, poetry, and he fell in love. He fell in love with Harriet Taylor. So his discovery of love and romance and poetry and all the aspects of Romanticism paralleled his discovery of Harriet Taylor. The only problem with falling madly in love with Harriet Taylor was Harriet Taylor had a husband. So 25-year-old John Stuart Mill fell in love with 23-year-old Harriet Taylor, who had a Mr. Taylor husband. Look at how articulate this grown-up adult guy is looking back. In the first place, these poems address themselves powerfully to one of the strongest of my pleasurable susceptibilities, the love of rural objects. See what I told you? Walking in the woods and the path and the daffodils and the bubbling brook. See, I told you. And natural scenery, to which I'd been indebted not only for much of the pleasure of my life. Incidentally, they lived in this suburb that was kind of on the edge of the very urbanized London. So he could go out on the pathway and walk out of the city easily. And that's what he did all the time. That's what Dickens did all the time. I'd been indebted not only for much of the pleasure of my life, but quite recently for relief from one of my longest lapses into depression. Walks in the country. In this power of rural beauty over me, there was a foundation laid for taking pleasure in Wordsworth's poetry. Absolutely. This is the classic 19th century love of Romanticism, i.e., the love of the whole of the 19th century city boys. All those famous novelists, they're all city boys, Flaubert, every one of them, and all their novels and all their books have the country, going out to the country. One of the earliest scenes in Flaubert's fabulous Sentimental Education is a journey in a boat barge on the Seine out into the country, out of the city and out into the country. So this is it. This is Monet. This is Cézanne, Degas. Every single one of these people goes out into the country, does their paintings, and comes back. So then this kid who has struggled from age 20 to 27 or 8 gets hit with the revolution in France in 1830. Now remember, this is a very impressionable moment in his life. He's 24, and he's just at the peak of this new Romanticism, and he's just inundated. Imagine if he's read all of Byron, and it's 1827, 28. I mean, he's reading constantly, and he certainly read Shelley and Keats too, and then he prefers Wordsworth. So he's just jacked up to romantic high, and he is hit with the French Revolution. Everybody's reading about it. In this frame of mind, the French Revolution of July 1830. In this frame of mind, the French Revolution of July 1830 hit me. It roused my utmost enthusiasm and gave me, as it were, a new existence. I went to Paris at once and was introduced to Lafayette and laid the groundwork of the intercourse afterwards that kept up with several of the active chiefs of the extreme popular party. After my return, I entered warmly as a writer into the political discussions of the time, which soon became still more exciting by the coming in of Lord Grey's ministry and the Reform Bill. And you all know exactly what that is. So anyway, here we are with Lord Grey's ministry in 1832 and the proposing of the Reform Bill. And for the next few years, I wrote copiously in newspapers. 1830, French Revolution of 1830. Now, you know this one, of course, isn't the first big one. First big one is 1789. This is 1830. Who exactly is getting revolutionized? Well, it's the old Bourbon kings, the two brothers of the guillotined Louis XVI. They have been given back the throne when Napoleon is beaten at Waterloo. At the council in Vienna, they say, let the old Bourbon family come back and be kings of France. So they do, and they get to be king from 1815 to 1830. Two of them. And by this time, They are very much senior citizens, both of them, and neither of whom have any kids. But both of them have been, just waiting around for the defeat of Napoleon. And then, of course, they get to be king of France again. And they are not in any way popular in France because they've just basically been stuck back on the throne by the Allies, by the English and the Russians. And so nobody particularly cares for them. And then all of a sudden, in 1830, Paris and France just goes up in flames. Here's the famous painting by Delacroix, the greatest romantic painter in France. Certainly someone who John Stuart Mill met. Now, one of the things that we can notice about his telling this story is if this kid is going to Paris in 1830, which is a pretty disturbed city, he must have had a lot of friends of his father who are helping him to get to meet Lafayette. In France, he's a hero. He's an early leader in the French Revolution. And so here we are, 1830. Revolution, he's one of the leaders. Now he's a very senior citizen guy by this time. So there's J.S. Mill getting to meet Lafayette. If you think about it, you couldn't have a more perfect romanticism in this kid. I mean, you just couldn't have it better. Here he is, moved by Wordsworth in his poetry to become, a real deep thinker, feeler. Then, just when he's at his peak of romanticism, he gets to go see a revolution. He gets on the boat, and he goes to France, and he goes to Paris, and in Paris he gets to see Lafayette, and he says, oh boy, we've got a revolution. Oh my God, I love this. So it couldn't be better. At the same time, there's this man in France writing his spectacular book, Democracy in America, de Tocqueville, and he's there when the revolution takes place. And of course, when his book comes out in 1835, everybody's going to read it, including J.S. Mill. It's all about democracy and how it works. The great leader of Italian unification, Cavour, considered it the most remarkable book of the 19th century, and I think he's right, along with On Liberty. I would put On Liberty in front of this book, but this would be number 2. In any case, so here's the Tocqueville, same time that all of this is happening, 1830s. And in England, and we talked about this, in England, we have revolution in France, and France is disrupted, and France is all pulled apart, and they scurry around and try to find a new government. But in England, what's happening? Well, the Parliament is marching to reform. It's starting to pass the Reform Bill. And here's the man who's leading it, Charles Grey, the boyfriend of the Duchess of Devonshire. He doesn't look like much of a boyfriend here, but of course the boyfriend stuff has been over for 30 years. He's now nice married Earl. And yes, he is exactly the man who makes your tea for you every morning, the Earl Grey tea. Yes, that's named for him. So there they are in the middle of reform, and it's going to be constitutional reform. It's Great Britain enjoying tolerant, enlightened, capable government reform while the rest of them are falling apart. As you know, it gets blocked, but finally the king cooperates and helps force Reform Bill. So here's J.S. Mill. It was the period of my mental progress, which I've now reached, that I formed the friendship which has been the honor and chief blessing of my existence, as well as the source of a great part of all that I have attempted to do, or hope to effect hereafter for human improvement. Does that sound like a declaration of falling madly in love with somebody? Is that the way all your boyfriends wrote about falling in love with you? Or is that how you girls waited to hear from him? It was the period of my mental progress which I have now reached, that I formed the friendship with which has been the honor and chief blessing of my existence, as well as the source of a great part of all that I have attempted to do. Well, that's the story. My first introduction to the lady who, after a friendship of 20 years, consented to be my wife. Now, that's a lot of time, and it's quite a story, let me tell you. And now let's talk about the future Mrs. James Stuart Mill. Here's his autobiography, and incidentally, let me tell you, the autobiography is just a wonderful, wonderful book. It's a great autobiography because he is so literate and so articulate, but it's also fun to see what a kind of scientific nerd he is when he plunges into all this. So here's his description. So when with her husband's family, it was the renewal of an old acquaintanceship. His grandfather, meaning the future Mrs. Mill's then husband, his grandfather lived in the next house to my father's in Newington Green. And I had sometimes, when a boy, been invited to play in the old gentleman's garden. He was a fine specimen of the old Scotch Puritan, stern, severe, powerful, but very kind to children, on whom such men make a lasting impression. Although it was years after my introduction to Mrs. Taylor, before my acquaintance with her became at all intimate or confidential, I very soon felt her to be the most admirable person I had ever known. So here's the story. His family, his father, happens to live next door to Mrs. Taylor's husband's grandfather. Now, this is exactly how J.S. Mill was going to meet some girlfriend. She was going to be living next door. She was going to be visiting next door. She was going to be coming to his father's journal or something. But this guy was not Byronic enough to go zipping around London and find a gorgeous woman like Dickens did. Dickens didn't hesitate to grab a teenage beauty when he felt the itch, but not J.S. Mill. So here's how it starts. His health, this is his father, 1836. Huge moment in his life. His father's health has been declining. Symptoms became unequivocally those of pulmonary consumption, TB. And after lingering the last stage of ability, he died on 23rd of June, 1836. Until the last few days of his life, there was no apparent abatement of intellectual vigor. His interest in all things and persons that had interested him through life was undiminished, nor did the approach of death cause the smallest wavering in his convictions on the subject of religion. Boo! That terrible thing. So there you have the great utilitarian all the way through to the end, being tough, rational, writing his articles, undiminished, and when they tell him you're dying, he says, okay, so be it.